Did you know that a lot of the research out there that gets pushed by media outlets may not be based on valid science? And did you know that nutritional guidelines are not always validated by solid research? If you find yourself confused by all the nutritional trends out there from plant based to carnivore, my brilliant guest today, Dr. Zoe Harcombe, will end the confusion when it comes to two key nutritional pieces of advice. Should we eat more fruits, veggies, and whole grains for health and longevity? And two, is red meat and animal products good or bad for us? Dr. Zoe is an independent researcher in the field of nutrition and health, and she dedicates her work to dissecting popular research studies, uncovering their validity and their shortcomings, and in the process, busting a lot of the popular nutritional myths out there. These myths keep people confused and struggling to improve their health and weight despite their best efforts. So, this conversation will blow your mind. Dr. Zoe has a PhD in dietary fat guidelines. So, I asked her to tell us how the carb and fat confusion came about.
This was a real penny drop moment for me. So imagine a little circle in front of you. There are only three things that we eat with calories. Let's forget alcohol. So three macronutrients: carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Now, it is a nutritional factoid that protein tends to form about 15, maybe 20% of any natural diet. And that actually applies for vegetarians as well as omnivores. So it just is a nutritional fact. So the other two macronutrients are the ones that vary. Now, when I realised, and it really is just so obvious, but not everybody realises this, in 1977 in the US and then in 1983 in the UK. So the US, read Canada, North America, and then Australia and New Zealand followed suit quite soon after. When they set a dietary guideline of you should eat no more than 30% of your calories in the form of fat, because of where protein is at, that inevitably meant that we were going to have at least 55% of our diet in the form of carbohydrate. And there is actually a statement in the very first dietary goals for the US, which was set by Senator McGovern back in 1977. And they actually spelled it out: eat at least 55% of your diet in the form of carbohydrate. Now, when we mandated that, we didn't know that eating that much carbohydrate was safe, let alone that it was going to be a good idea. We just had no idea. But we had this idea that fat was bad. Now, just very briefly, where did we get that idea from? That goes right back to the beginning of last century, when some Russian pathologists were looking at people who died, men basically, who died suddenly, and they were opening them up because they were pathologists and they were finding lipids around the scene of damage. And they said, oh, we think that's cholesterol. They didn't think, well, maybe the cholesterol went to help the damage. It's just kind of like, oh, cholesterol seems to be the problem. Wind forward about 50 years, Ansel Keys started looking at dietary fat, dietary cholesterol, trying to understand what was causing heart disease again in men. Only men were studied right up until about trying to understand what happened. Got this idea, first of all, that dietary cholesterol was the problem, dismissed that, then started looking more at dietary fat. Not many people know he didn't get very far with that one either. When he did his really famous 7 country study, which was published in 1970, they were actually quite weak conclusions. It's kind of cholesterol tends to be related to saturated fat, and saturated fat tends to be related to heart disease in men in this particular age group, but it was very weak. But these sort of myths then just set in the minds of people. In comes this Senator McGovern, who'd just been on a low-fat boot camp. Now imagine he's probably had a senator's diet, eating junk food, bit overweight, goes on a Whole Foods, albeit low-fat, week away, and he feels amazing. It's, oh, this is what the whole of America should be doing. So we just got this idea built up, that really is a potted history, built up over 100 years, that fat was bad for us. And by demonizing fat, the inevitability was that people ended up eating way more carbohydrate. Now, if you look back at it and say, well, what has happened over the last 50 years? Obesity has exploded, type 2 diabetes has exploded, heart disease actually hasn't got much better. If you take out the improvement from smoking, we've still got a lot of dietary issues with heart disease. So we haven't done a great job, but it all came about because of this idea that we demonise fat. So yes, you're right, my PhD went back to 1977 and said, okay, let me imagine I was the Dietary Guidelines Committee at that point, I want to look at all the evidence. I want to look at the best evidence, which is meta-analyses, pooling together all of the evidence available. So I want to pull together all the randomized controlled trial evidence. I want to pull together all the population study evidence, and I want to look at all of those. So there ended up being 4 papers looking at population evidence then and now, randomized controlled trial evidence then and now. And again, to cut a story short, there is absolutely zero evidence whatsoever that we should have changed those dietary guidelines. There was just none then, there's none now, and the consequences have been catastrophic.
Thank you so much for this beautiful overview. And I think there's such a myth that when people see those guidelines, they expect it to be based on hardcore black and white science, right? Which is very much, like you said, not exactly the case, especially how we interpret science and look at the actual data. And in parallel to that, I would also love to explore the whole idea of eating more fruits and vegetables. And I would frame it from the perspective of most people are taught and understand it to be a way to eat healthier. And sure, if you're comparing that against an ultra processed food diet, very much like you mentioned, yeah, they will win. But is fruits and vegetables part of a true healthy diet? Are they essential as part of a healthy diet?
They can be part of a healthy diet, but they are definitely not essential. So, essential in nutrition means something we must consume. So, it doesn't mean essential in the normal sense of the word. So, I often use the example of cholesterol and say, well, cholesterol is essential. We would
Mm-hmm.
die as human beings if we did not have cholesterol inside us. But the body doesn't rely on you to eat it, the body makes it. The body says it's so important. I'm not going to risk that you're not going to get it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to make it internally. So, essentially, nutrition means something that we must eat. So, there are essential fats. We know them as omega 3 and omega 6, and they need to come in a particular form. And there are essential proteins, which are what we call the essential amino acids. There's a little bit of debate, are there 8, are there 9? But we can pretty much list out what the essential amino acids are. Then there are vitamins and minerals. We've got a lot more certainty on vitamins. So there are 4 fat soluble vitamins. There are then the water soluble vitamins. So you've got vitamin C, and then you've got the 8B vitamins. Those are your water soluble vitamins. And then there's quite a lot of minerals, and there'd be debate on how many of those are essential. But things like iron, copper, zinc, magnesium, sodium, potassium, they're very much essential minerals. So I always look at what we should be eating on just a very, very factual way. We've got those essential nutrients. That's the same for everyone. Those are what we should be eating. So where do you find them? And I'm very mathematical, so I like putting together spreadsheets. I like going on the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, All Foods database, and I just make little spreadsheets. So I put all the essential fats, complete proteins, vitamins, and minerals down the left hand side, and then I put columns. I'm not looking at processed food because you shouldn't be eating that. So I'm looking at what should be very healthy, real food. So the best food I've ever found, and I've challenged people to come up with one better, and I still can't come up with one better, and that's chicken liver. Then you would look at an oily fish, so maybe sardines, particularly the ones with the bones and the skin, and then you're really getting the calcium, the phosphorus, the vitamin D, the bone nutrients. Then you put in a green leafy vegetable, maybe a kale or a spinach. Then you can put in a typical fruit, an apple, orange, banana. You can put in a starchy carbohydrate, brown rice. You can put in plant protein, lentils, red meat if you want to compare steak. And then you just put in the nutrients next to them per 100 grams. So you can do it in a number of ways. You can do it per 100 grams of food, or you could do it, for example, per 100 calories. Will take the raw form, because if, for example, I take 100 grams of steak and you like yours really rare and I like mine a little bit more well done, our 100 grams is not going to end up as 100 grams. So you're going to get more of your steak if it's not so well done. I'm going to get less if I'm looking at a more well done steak. So then you just look at the nutrients that are in those, and then you just compare across the columns and you just say, okay, which one's the winner? And I did this recently with avocado. I know you're a very kind reader of the Monday Note, and we did one with avocado. And it's like, I'm sorry, we put in chicken liver, we put in sardines as an oily fish, we put in a green vegetable, we put in an olive oil if you think that avocados are good for the monounsaturated fats. And you just realise that unfortunately avocado doesn't win for anything. and a fruit and a vegetable just won't win for anything. They just won't in terms of the essential nutrients, not just the essential nutrients, but the form in which you need them. So people will say, oh, dark green leafy vegetables, they're really good for iron. Yeah, but the plant form for iron is not as bioavailable as the heme iron, which we can find in seafood and red meat. So every time you see two nutrients, so you see, for example, vitamin A, it comes in the form of retinol, which comes from animals. It comes in the form from carotene, which comes from plants. Guess which one the body wants? It wants the
Yeah.
retinol. Essential fats, the body wants DHA and EPA, which come from animal foods. It doesn't want ALA, which can come from seaweed or plant foods or whatever. And I was a vegetarian for a very long period of time. It was really tough for me to accept. I'm sorry, but nature is telling us that it wants us to be eating primarily animal foods to get the nutrients that we need. So, yeah, it can be, fruit and veg can be part of a healthy diet, but they are not essential in nutrition fact terms, and they will not be able to compete with animal foods for the things that we do actually need.
How fictitious the Mediterranean diet really is. So I would love for you to give us, and I've heard you speak to this before, and I think it's brilliant, of what the fictitious version that we see sometimes cited in research versus what the actual way that the Mediterranean eat, which is not one specific diet, but it's like a collection of diets. So give us that contrast with the frame of we believing that it's filled with whole grains and it's great for longevity and good health. Give us the truth.
I'm very fortunate living in Europe more so than North Americans. I get to be able to go to the Mediterranean on a very regular basis. There are some years when I will have been very fortunate and I've got to go to the Mediterranean 4, 5, maybe even 6 times because I'm just so close. So if you look on a map and you look at the Mediterranean Sea and then you look at the countries that are in the Mediterranean Sea or bordering the Mediterranean Sea, and you've got countries like Malta and Greece and Italy, and France will sort of touch the Mediterranean Sea, and Spain, but only on the sort of right hand side, otherwise you're over to the Atlantic. So you kind of look at that Mediterranean region. Having been there so many times and having been there for about 20 years when I was a vegetarian, so I was used to eating what I thought were healthy whole grains. I have never seen a healthy whole grain in the Mediterranean. If you go to Italy, you are going to have ciabatta bread, which is white. You have white rice. You have white pasta. If you go to Spain, the risotto is white rice. If you go to France, the bread is baguette, which is white bread. You've got potatoes, which are not really grainy, but they're white. I literally cannot think of a grain that you find in the Mediterranean which looks like the ones that you get in a British supermarket, which have kind of been created because they've told us that whole grains are good. So that's what we go for. Now, more when I go recently, you'll see like a token piece of brown bread or something at the breakfast buffet in the morning. And you think, oh, that's been put there for the Brits because they're the only ones that reach for that. The French people are still reaching for the baguettes and the Italians are reaching for the ciabatta, and the French will also be eating the croissants, which are white flour. So this whole grain myth, it is just an absolute myth in the Mediterranean. And the other thing that is an absolute myth is that they don't eat many animal foods and that they tend to get their protein from things like beans, pulses, legumes, lentils, all that kind of thing. If I could sum up the Mediterranean diet, and I know this as a vegetarian because it was so difficult for such a long period of time, the Mediterranean diet can be summed up by if it moves, eat it. And they will literally eat anything that's moved. So they eat frogs, they eat snails, they eat horse, they eat rabbit, they eat pigeon, they eat guinea fowl, they eat quail. They, if it moves, they eat it. Go into any Mediterranean restaurant or just Google and say, what's the best Mediterranean restaurant here? Or give me a typical Mediterranean restaurant from a 5-star, 4-star, 3-star, whatever what you want, Mediterranean restaurant in France, Spain, Italy, wherever you want to go to, and look at the menu. You really struggle as a vegetarian. I mean, particularly when I was
Mhm.
a sort of coming out of Cambridge student vegetarian and then going over there, because it was very much when I was younger, you'd look down the menu and it's kind of like, where's the vegetarian option? Sometimes you just have to say, well, gratin dauphinois is cheese on potatoes. Okay, that's my meal. Can you just give me cheese on potatoes and give me a nice sort of salad by the side of it or something? Or can you give me a salad niçoise, which is a tuna salad, but don't put the anchovies on and don't put the tuna on? And they kind of look at you like, okay, that's an egg salad. And I meant, great, I'll have an egg salad. It was difficult because it is just rabbit, quail, horse, snails. beef, lamb, pork, chicken, turkey. They love turkey there as well. Every meat that you can think of, they will eat. So your typical dinner in the Mediterranean is very heavy on animal foods. So your starter might be Parma ham and melon. So you've still got some non-vegetarian stuff in there. Your main course is going to be meat or fish. For dessert, they're very much cream and cheese based, so you're much more likely to have a cheese course than you are dessert. If you have both, then you've got the cheese course, which is not with loads of crackers. Quite often it's just a platter of cheese and maybe some grapes. They don't even bother with the starchy carbohydrates. And then the desserts are very much cream based as opposed to sugar based, which is the British kind of Canadian American kind of dessert. So as a vegan, you wouldn't, you'd have the melon and you'd have the salad with the main course. You wouldn't have the cheese course, you'd have a couple of grapes, and you wouldn't have the dessert. You just have to ask for some berries with that cream. It's so animal focused, but they eat
Yeah.
very, very differently to how we eat in the Northern Europe and over in America. They don't graze, they have breakfast. They have lunch and then they have a big dinner where the family sit down and they eat food properly. They don't eat in between meals. They don't finish their dinner and then sit in front of Netflix and watch stuff and eat popcorn and eat junk for the rest of the evening. They have 3 meals and they're good, real food, whole meals, quite big meals. And that's fine for them. And then that sees them through to the next day. But this idea, this construct of the Mediterranean diet has basically been invented by Harvard professors who like to think that it's their sort of healthy, in inverted commas, nonsense of plant protein, plant based, plant whole grains, fruits and vegetables. Nobody eats like that in the Mediterranean. They just don't.
I do have university degrees on meat production systems. So I had the privilege early on to really have my mind opened to the value of meats and things like that. There is quite a bit of misrepresentation and also negative press when it comes to red meat specifically. So let's maybe debunk that. Is red meat beneficial or not for women, especially as we age?
Oh my goodness. I remember I went to a conference. It was actually a Western Price conference back in 2010. And I was messaging my husband under the table saying, I'm coming back as a non-veggie. And he was kind of like, what? What's happened here? And I went home and it was quite close to Good Friday. So I thought I'll pick a date that's really memorable. So it's kind of like Good Friday 2010. And I started eating meat. It was almost instant, the improvement in my well-being. And my husband just noticed it instantly. He's like, your mood is so much better. You just seem to have more energy. Your cycles, he would recognize. All women, we really try to be nice during the cycle. You get that bit, particularly as you're heading up to your period, just thinking, do you know, I just feel like blue and like the world is descending upon me for a couple of days and then everything lifts kind of thing. And you just try to stay upbeat because you know it's just about to lift. But your person who lives with you, your nearest and dearest, can't help but notice you're not your usual self and you're
Yeah.
trying to be more bouncy than you feel. But he said the difference in your cycles just straight away, just so much more even. I would have been getting the bioavailable iron that my body so wanted. I would have been getting the zinc, all the stuff that's there in red meat. And it was almost just as if my body was saying, oh, I've been crying out for this, but you just haven't read the signals. So one of the things that I present, not necessarily just to women, but generally at conferences, because as you say, the misinformation about meat is spectacular. So I put up these
Mhm.
slides and Andy, my husband, helped me with the slides. So I start off with a sort of outline of a steak. And it's a typical steak from the United States Department of Agriculture database. They have some that have numbers, and I think it was something like Ermis 2244 or something. One of their most standard products. Like, okay, I'll take that. And I say, okay, imagine that little image of the steak is my 100 grams. And 100 grams then makes it really easy for percentages. So I'm going to piece together what this steak actually is. You click the pointer for the presentation, and then suddenly 71% of that image there goes blue, which is water. So 71% of your piece of meat, just to start straight away, is water. Then you click it again, and 21% is protein. and that then filtered up. So you've not got very much left now. Then you've got about 1%, which is ash and other minerals and stuff that you'll find in meat, because that's very impressive, your degrees in that. Then you've got 7 grams left, 7 percentage points, which is your fat. And then I put on which of those are saturated fat, which is 2. So when I hear dietitians saying meat is full of saturated fat, I'm like, hang on a second. Like, where do you even get this nonsense from?
Yes.
Is this what they teach you in dietitian school? Because this is just not fact. And if you say that, you've got to be able to back that up with fact. They go around. It's like they go around saying, oh, we should eat 5 a day. It's like, where is the evidence base for that? There is absolutely none. I've looked for it. I've asked public health bodies. This idea meat is full of saturated fat is full of water. Then it's full of protein. And then of the fat, saturated fat is not even the major part. You'll virtually struggle to find a meat where monounsaturated fat is not the single biggest fat. Now,
Yeah.
you do get things like, so I've enjoyed looking at this for meat. So things like venison, which, as you'll know, is really lean. It's so low
Hmm.
in fat that when you actually look at the fat composition, sometimes it's only a gram of fat. And then it's okay, half a gram is unsaturated, close to half a gram is saturated. It's getting so little fat, it's getting to the point that saturated is getting close to unsaturated, but you're still talking about 0.5% of your
Yeah.
venison meat is actually saturated fat. So this idea that it's full of saturated fat is just complete and utter nonsense. The only food group, and I'm talking about food groups now, so what are your food groups? Meat, fish, eggs, dairy, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, beans and pulses. So those are your 9. And then when people say, what about oils? It's take them in the group to which they belong. So avocado, call it a fruit. So therefore that's a fruit oil. And almonds, from the nut group, that's an almond oil. And nuts and seeds, so we've got sunflower seeds, that's from the seed oil group. So those are your 9 food groups. So the only food group that has more saturated fat than unsaturated fat is dairy products. So everywhere else you're going to find more unsaturated fat than you are saturated fat. So stop going around saying meat is full of saturated fat or red meat or steak or anything like that, because just factually it's not true. As a single food, obviously coconut oil is predominantly saturated fat, but that's not a food group. That's a food within a food group. Dairy foods are the only food group where you'll have more saturated than unsaturated fat. Not that saturated fat is bad and unsaturated fat is good. Why would nature put all of them in all the same foods if one was
Yeah.
bad and the other was good? It's bonkers. And get the nutrition facts. That'd be a really good idea.
And what about things such as correlations, as in quotations on that word, that we see on the media about eating red meat and cancer, or even things like diabetes and heart disease? Give us that aspect as well of what the science does not prove about the impact of red meat in those health conditions.
Yeah, red meat and diabetes has just got to be the maddest one of all, because type 2 diabetes, type 1, obviously autoimmune condition, type 2 related to insulin resistance, overproducing insulin for a long period of time. What would that make? What would make that happen? Too much carbohydrate too often. So grazing on everything, whether it's a good carbohydrate, whether it's bananas all day long, whether it's bad carbohydrates, junk food or whatever, just your body having to clear the glucose out of your bloodstream too often, too much. We need 1 teaspoon of glucose in our bloodstream at any one time, 4 grams, 4 to 5 grams. The minute you eat a banana and you chuck in about 20 grams, not all of that is glucose, some of it is fructose, but let's say you've chucked in 12 grams of glucose by eating one banana. That was 3 times what your body wanted, and your body had 4 grams already, because it has this incredible system with insulin and glucagon to keep it at that perfect 4 grams. As long as you're not diabetic, it will just keep it there. And then you went and chucked in 3 times what it wanted to have already. So people think, oh, banana really healthy. It's got to get it out. So diabetes is about glucose, it's about insulin, it's about carbohydrate. It's not about fat and protein. It just isn't. And protein can impact insulin, but it can't impact blood glucose levels. And fat, of course, doesn't impact insulin or blood glucose levels. So that is actually your single sort of healthiest macronutrient for avoiding type 2 diabetes. So the idea that red meat is even associated with type 2 diabetes, let alone causes it, is just so mad. What do I think is going on here? It's the confounder. So almost all of these studies come out from North America. So they tend to come out from particularly America rather than just Canada, but they come out from the Harvard group that I mentioned earlier that want us to be eating these whole grains and legumes and fruits and vegetables. They've got very much a sort of plant-based agenda that they've been driving forward for many years. They're trying to demonize red meat. So the studies are done in America. The most common red meats in America are burgers and hot dogs. And they say that. You look at the small print or you look at the
Mhm.
food frequency questionnaire. I've looked at some food frequency questionnaires and they say lasagna counts as in the meat group. Lasagna is white pasta and bechamel sauce and a little bit of mince. Or sandwiches, meat sandwiches. Again, you actually count in the carbohydrate as meat in the original food frequency questionnaire, even if they don't make that mistake. So even if we set aside sandwiches and lasagna and we said, okay, it's just the burger, it's never just the burger or the hot dog. Hot dogs are pretty
Yeah.
rubbish. What comes with the burger? Fries, a bun, ketchup or mayonnaise, gherkins, plastic cheese, fizzy drink, milkshake. The kind of person that is eating that kind of McDonald's or Burger King, those kind of fast foods, and that's how they're getting their meat intake. So they end up in the group as the highest meat intake eaters, but they're all also the highest vegetable oil consumers. They're the highest fries and burger bun and milkshake and Coca-Cola consumers. Do I think those things could be associated with type 2 diabetes? Absolutely. Were they adjusted for in the study? No, not at all. Never were. So what you've actually
Mhm.
measured is the person who's eating the burgers and the fries and the buns, and then you're blaming the burger, which in some burger joints is actually quite healthy. If you are a low carb person, I actually think McDonald's, you could probably tell me better than I know. I actually think some of these Burger Kings and McDonald's actually source some pretty decent mince to put into their burgers. There's nothing wrong with mince. It's the whole animal. It's probably more nutritious in many ways than just going for the steak every time because you are getting other bits of the animal and a higher fat content and just generally better for you. But what those studies are telling you is the people who are eating the buns and the fries and the milkshakes and all the rest of it, but they're just so happy to damn red meat in the name of all the other junk that gets eaten with red meat. They have not studied carnivores or keto people who are trying to source their red meat really sustainably and nicely and for health and eating quality grass-fed steak and making their own burgers at home and know their farmer, know their fishmonger, get their eggs locally, dairy similarly, all of that kind of thing. They're not studying those people when they come out with this nonsense.
Did this conversation surprise you? Let me know in the comments what resonated. And if you want to check any of Dr. Zoe's blog posts that we mentioned during this interview, I will link them below this video. I will be bringing Dr. Zoe back for part two, where we will be discussing another very popular topic, cholesterol, and what women must know, especially if you're in your 40s, 50s, or 60s. So make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can get notified when part two of this conversation comes out, and check this video next on how I help my clients determine the best diet for weight release after 40 based on your own DNA.